Today I'm going to be doing a casual discussion style comparison / review of these two solar guitars, the A1.6 and the S1.6. I'm going to talk about the similarities, which there are a lot of, the differences, the pros and cons between each one of these, and why you might choose one over the other. This isn't going to be super scientific or anything. I'm going to be speaking on my experiences in using these guitars. I do the casual online music kind of thing, so I make music videos, I record music, I put it on internet streaming services. I'm not in some amazing touring band or anything. I'm not a virtuoso by any means. I'm basically some guy on the internet who likes guitars, as you could clearly see. I'm also not going to be passing judgment on super obvious things like the pickups, because these two guitar models technically have different pickups. You've got the A, it has the standard, the typical Duncan Solars, and this S has the Duncan Solar Pluses. So I will kind of talk about how they differ in sound a little bit, but this isn't a full-on comparison between the pickups. Talking about the guitars in general. Also, I have to say I'm not sponsored by Solar or Ibanez or any other brands or things that I mention in this video. These are my guitars and I bought them and I've used them. So let's jump right into it. I'm going to talk about the first impressions I got when getting these guitars. So unboxing these and coming to play them every day, every week, they are pretty attractive looking guitars. I'm a fan of the aesthetic. Looking at them in passing definitely makes me want to pick them up and play them. Not just the body, not just the neck, not just the fretboard and the frets, but the whole package. It's very pleasing to look at. You can even see they have the reverse headstocks too, which are nice. They look cool, and another benefit of them is that when you're tuning, your hand can naturally be like this, instead of having to bend over a bit more to turn on the top. Just a little thing that's nice. And I know these have the Evertune, we'll talk about it later, but you still have to adjust the tuning pegs. It's a tension-based system. Both of these guitars have good balance and weight. They're not ultra light, they're not really heavy, they're somewhere in between. I'd say medium, slightly medium heavy. They do have all this metal hardware in them from the Evertune. And they're both a solid block of alder, although this has the maple veneer. So essentially it's alder with a maple sticker on top. They're essentially the same materials and build in that respect. You've got the alder bodies, the set-in necks. Some difference in finish you could see. The A has the matte finish across the whole neck. The S has the wood with some kind of finish over it, which I'll talk about in a bit also. They're both superstrats with 2 humbuckers, 5-way switches, Evertunes, 2 knobs. You got your volume and your tone potentiometers, ebony fretboards, all that stuff, the stainless steel frets. Picking each one up, the finish feels nice. The matte finish is very pleasing to the touch, especially on the back of the neck. I was surprised at how good it felt. Maybe over time it's going to gloss over and be sticky, but I've used this guitar for a few years on multiple songs, long recording sessions, and it's not sticky yet. Whereas this finish they put on the neck here, it's kind of like that played-in finish. I don't know exactly what it's called, but you'll notice on higher-end guitars with the exposed wood, I guess on the neck, they do put a kind of finish to make it feel more played-in, and so that's pretty pleasing to the touch too. They feel a little different, but they're both pretty fast to play on. Of course, when these guitars arrived, I did take them out of the box, did a quick playthrough test to make sure they worked, all the electronics would work and stuff, and they did. The first playthrough impression was that these are pretty awesome riff machines that you could shred on too. They sounded pretty good, pretty decent through my practice setup, and eventually when I would use them on recordings, they sounded pretty good in those too. Of course, we've all heard of the Solar fretboard issues with the whole cracking and all that. I've bought a bunch of Solars by now. I find them very useful. The combination of the good price point, they've got all the features I want. The Evertune is very helpful in recording. And I haven't had any cracking issues with the fretboards. My usual routine for getting a guitar is I get it in the mail, I let it acclimate a bit to the temperature and humidity of my area. I take off the strings, condition the fretboard, and restring it and set up the guitar. And then I'll restring and condition the fretboard every 6 months to a year about. That's the interval I do. So I haven't had any issues in that respect. Alright, so let's talk about the playing feel of these guitars now. You can see both have the classic kind of superstrat shape to them. So that's going to be what you're getting here. You're getting the kind of block body. You see it's flat on top. You've got the forearm contour, no surprises there. Each one has a belly carve. I notice on the Solars versus other guitars, the belly carve is a bit shallower. When it comes to how far down it comes this way, it's still just as deep going this way. Just a little note, it doesn't really matter too much in playability. I guess it's nice because you get more of the flat back, which I prefer, but the belly carve is very useful, especially as I'm getting on in years. Also, speaking of the back of the guitar, the strap button on the upper horn is on the back instead of on the corner where it would typically be. So that's interesting. Like, it balances just fine. The strap is going to be a bit like slightly further in then. And when you're sitting with it in certain ways, it can poke you like this a little bit, but you got to really be like contorting for that to be an issue. If you have decent playing posture, it's just fine. And when you're standing up, it is also just fine. I guess if you have some like irritation or rash or something like that, then the strap over there could be an issue, but then maybe straps in general would be an issue and you probably have a different problem. One important note though is that the necks, you can't really see it because the necks are very similar, very close in shape and profile, but they are different. The A model here has a slightly thinner and flatter neck. I mean, it's still like a thin-ish C. They're both thin-ish C shapes. So I'm really picking at ultra minor details. But if you play these a lot and back to back, you will notice this has like a slightly thinner neck, and this neck is slightly more rounded. It's not enough of a difference to make you want to return it if you say you don't prefer rounded necks. Like, I wouldn't be like, oh, this has a rounded neck and I want it flat or fast, so I'm going to return it. It's not really that big of a difference. It's just worth pointing out. I have noticed between solar models, there is some variation in the necks. For example, I have an A1.6 and I notice its neck is a bit, I want to say thicker than the V1.7 I have, which feels a whole lot more flat. Funny enough, the A1.7 is my go-to 7th string because it's just so comfortable. I can play it for the longest, and it sounds pretty good too. Also on the necks and feel, first on the A, the satin finish here feels a whole lot better than I thought it would. Like, I was thinking, because I don't really prefer gloss finishes on the backs of necks, I was thinking, oh, it's a matte finish, so it's going to be okay. It's going to be meh. This will be more just like a workhorse when you need things to stay in tune. But playing through it, you really don't get hung up on the finish. It's nice and fast and smooth. If you play it enough, you kind of prefer it after a while over just like a raw wooden feel, because it feels finished yet fast. And I think over time, the matte finish might get polished by the hand, but it hasn't happened yet, and it's been a few years. So I've gotten plenty of mileage out of this guitar so far with no issues in neck feel. The S right here, the S1.6, it has that kind of, like I mentioned earlier, that finish they put over wood to make it feel played in. And while it doesn't feel as high quality as something that would be on a guitar basically double the price, for the price, it does feel pretty good compared to guitars that are either the same price or a little less. It's a little better than what you would expect. So no issues there too. If I had to compare these two, I'd say this one feels slightly faster to play versus this one, but maybe over time this finish might become glossy and stickier. We'll see, we'll find out. Now on the front of the neck, the stainless steel frets, they're pretty good. I'm pretty biased because I do prefer stainless steel over the nickel silver. Like, this is the 1 series, so there is that stainless steel. If you do prefer the nickel silver frets, there are some merits to them, and these are tools for the trade. We're trying to make music and pick the right tool for the job. So if you prefer the feel, the not too slippery feel of the nickel silver, easier to work with, there is still high quality nickel silver that'll last a long time. You know, good for you, that's great. Personally, I just prefer the stainless steel. And with these, there's no surprises. They weren't rough, they were finished just enough. Maybe not completely mirror polished because these are built to a price point, but no rough spots at all. I'd say the fret edges on these, they're not sharp at all. These don't have the most amazing fret jobs to them. The edges aren't particularly rounded or anything, but they're not gonna cut your hand as you play through, and there's no frets that are particularly sticking out. So I'd say the fretwork on this is pretty good. I haven't had to try and fix any of the fretwork. I haven't had to round any of the edges, etc., etc. So no concerns there. The binding, because this has black plastic binding and this is white plastic binding, is also pretty good. It's pretty good to decently passable. On this one, the binding was great. It's not rounded, but there's no sharp edges by any means, and I have played it in some. So this feels pretty good, like you would expect. This binding, it was a little rougher. You can feel the edge a bit more. It's not completely horrible, and it is starting to play in too. But every once in a while, I'll do a run like right here, and I'll notice, ooh, that's pretty square. So they're pretty usable to me, but if that's a major issue, like if you absolutely need the rolled fretboard edges, it might be difficult to find that at this price point anyway, but keep that in mind. And then finally, there's the Evertune. I'll talk about the Evertune playability soon, but in terms of the feel, it depends how you set up the Evertune. It is a tension-based system, so if you're closer to the bend zone, you need to tighten the strings a bit more to get there. So there might be a bit more string tension than what you're used to if you set it up to do that. So therefore, there's going to be the feel of tenser strings, tighter strings. Versus the opposite, if you're in the zone, like the middle zone, I think it's called zone 2, where bending the string does nothing, so it's perfectly in tune no matter what. You are going to have the same string tension as what you're used to. You just then have to get used to not being able to bend. And vibrato too. So if you're used to doing a lot of vibrato, a lot of bends, then you're going to have to get used to that feel. Again, I keep it in the bend zone. I do prefer less tension on the strings, but I've gotten used to this. And it is just so useful. Like, I keep doing it. I keep coming back to it. And how it feels to actually put your hand on the bridge itself. When it comes to bridges, my preference is a floating bridge, like the feel of it on my hand. So an Ibanez Low Pro Edge or a Floyd Rose Original Edge, etc. So I can see why some people, there it is, dislike the feel of this bridge because it's all square around the edges like that. But the saddles themselves, they're not too bad. They hold the string above them instead of within them, like on the floating bridges. And it's not too hard to get used to. You pick it up pretty quickly. It feels just fine. I do enjoy playing on it. I can see why people would dislike it, but I haven't had any issues there. Of course, if you push on the saddles, it does mess up things, but you have to push on the saddles much harder than you would have to push on a floating bridge. So that's a non-issue. I know there are some heavy-handed players out there where they absolutely cannot play on floating bridges or vintage trims or anything because they just push so hard. So if that's the case and you're just pushing the heck out of the guitar, then maybe it's an issue, but it's going to be pretty difficult. You're going to tire yourself out doing that. So speaking of playing these guitars, let's now talk about the playability. You take a look at these guitars, you see they're pretty much the same shape and they pretty much play the same way. They are both superstrats. No surprises there, pretty honest guitars. None of the components get in the way, you see everything is nicely spaced. You could see the volume knob isn't in a place where you could touch. The blade switch is where you would want to reach for it, so no issues there. You could see there's large, deep cutaways, so it doesn't get in the way of your hand. You could reach the 24th fret, no problem. The Type A also has these carveaways, you can see. So there is absolutely no issue getting to the top. In fact, you could see right here, it's so easy to get to the upper frets that sometimes you accidentally go for the non-existent 25th fret. See right there. So that actually might be an issue if you typically slide up and play a lot and don't really look at the fretboard. You might accidentally do that until you get used to it. And even then, in a more adrenaline-filled situation where you're trying to perform live, play in front of people, maybe at a party at home, you might accidentally do that. And then you notice on the S1.6, this doesn't have those carveaways. You could see it's flat until the edge. So like a typical super strat, like you think the Ibanez RG or something. But it's not an issue. You get to the 24th fret, you could see just fine. If you try really hard, you can feel that edge, but I've never felt it unless I was actually thinking about it and trying to do it. In practice, I never feel any limitation from that. We turn to the back. You see there isn't any contour on the lower horn. There's no contour there for your hand. But in playing, it's not an issue because the cutaways are so deep. The necks themselves are pretty fast. They are a bit more on the thin side. They've got some chunk to them. So I would say they're much thinner than Fenders. They're thicker than Ibanez's. The closest they feel to is like an LTD. Like if an LTD and an Ibanez had a child, had a kid, that guitar would feel like this. Like I mentioned previously, there are some inconsistencies between the neck profiles, even for the same models. So you might get a neck profile that's slightly thinner or slightly thicker. These are small differences, and in general, these guitars are gonna feel the same. If you pick one up one day, you pick another one up the next day. Unless you play a lot of different guitars and really have a feel for neck profiles and things, you're not going to really be able to tell the difference. And once you start playing too, even if you can feel the difference at first, that difference falls away because again, it's really small. I just have to bring it up for the sake of this discussion. And inconsistencies like this, the variations are going to exist in every guitar brand too. Whether you're buying these or Ibanez's or Fenders or Gibsons or anything, there are going to be some small variations in how the neck profile was done, depending on who was sanding it that day, who was carving it, whether the machine cutting out the block was working. So many factors go into building a guitar. So it can feel like luck getting the perfect neck profile, but that luck is going to exist no matter where you're trying to buy from or who you're trying to buy from. Overall, these play like riffing metal machines that you can also shred on, versus like an Ibanez, for example, which feels like an ultimate shred machine that you can also riff on, if that makes any sense. These feel pretty all-purpose, very versatile, a workhorse kind of axe with a focus on the metal. And also now the playability of the Evertune. It plays pretty much almost like a fixed bridge. You can't really push down too hard on it like I mentioned, because you will upset the saddles. But the force it takes to do that is much greater than the force it does for, say, a floating bridge. In general, the Evertune doesn't get in your way. I know I've got a sleeve on, but you can see this kind of raised back part doesn't get in the way of your hand, so it's pretty playable. And you don't feel this edge here because the strings are on top of the saddles. They're not recessed into them, and there is plenty of height. Oh, you can't really see that well, but there's plenty of height between where the string is and where the edge is. For me anyway, it doesn't get in the way of doing all the things I need to do, some chugs or whatever, some shreds when I try to do it. Of course, because the Evertune has all these springs in the back, it's a spring per string, it's a mechanical system. There is gonna be a loss of sustain. There's no giant tone block like you would get on a floating bridge. If you're doing a lot of long held notes, whole notes, multiple measures, it will be a problem. That's less of a problem of these guitars though, that's just with the Evertune. There are models without Evertunes. Now speaking of notes, let's talk about how these guitars sound. These are both guitars with solid alder bodies, ebony fretboards, you got the maple necks, stainless steel frets, typical stuff. And they sound like alder-bodied superstrats would. These pickups are geared towards metal, but they sound just amazing in mixes. So even if you don't play metal, if you're playing rock or blues with a lot of guitar tracks, these work perfectly. I don't have to cut any mids or do any weird things to make multiple layers of guitars work. Obviously, they have the two different sounding pickups. The A series has the typical Duncan solars, and they sound pretty good. They work really well in a mix. I've noticed on this guitar, these pickups do sound a bit thinner, maybe due to the Evertune, than on a solar that has the Duncan solar without an Evertune. And I'll talk about this guitar more in another video. But that isn't necessarily a bad thing. This guitar is actually my best guitar for having multi-layered stuff. I covered the Dark World theme from Zelda: Link to the Past, which is on streaming. And it's also a YouTube video on my channel. Go check it out, please. But because I had so many layers of guitars in that song, this was the natural choice. I used solely this guitar, and it worked perfectly. There weren't any crazy mid-range kind of constructive interferences where it was blowing up my mix. It worked out pretty perfectly. I'm really glad I was using this guitar. And there were some sustained notes in that too. Like I mentioned, the Evertune does rob some sustain, and I did have to coax out the note to survive longer, but it was doable. For more sane and regular mixes where there's only like 4 guitars, you know, rhythm, pan, right, left, you've got your lead, your harmony, maybe another lead going on, some panning here and there. I do prefer the sound of these Duncan Solar Pluses. They say they have more bass and treble, but overall it's a bit more fuller. I think that kind of, if they're saying more bass and more treble, that means mid scooped relative to the output of these, which does work pretty well for metal. But I really like the cleans on this too. Like the cleans of the neck, they're pretty nice. I was pleasantly surprised. I wouldn't say they're incredible, you know, they're still stock pickups. They're definitely usable. And the listener, the average listener, isn't going to be able to tell the difference. Really, because we're guitarists playing these guitars, we can feel the difference as we're playing, and we play it and then we hear the note come out and we play another guitar, we pick up another guitar and we play that, then we can hear and feel the differences between that. The average listener isn't going to be able to tell. Many guitarists either won't be able to tell or they won't care. There's really only those few vocal guitarists who will hate you no matter what you do, who might look at the guitar and say, I don't like that. So overall, the sound of these guitars has really worked for me. My roots are in 2000s metalcore, progressive metal, some thrash, things like that. These aren't really the genres I'm trying to stick to. That's just the music I was listening to a bunch as a teenager. So it stuck. It shaped how I think about writing and listening to music. And you could play rock or maybe even blues and jazz and stuff on these guitars too. Obviously, the look of these guitars is pushing you to buy these for a certain style, especially if you're performing live and people are singing your guitars. But they're pretty versatile. They both have the 5-way switch, so you get many tonal options. And with these tonal options, you can combine that with using different plugins or using different amplifiers to get a variety of different sounds depending on your needs. The tuning stability of these guitars, again thanks to the Evertune, is also really helpful for playing chords, whether you're playing jazz chords that have all those kinds of crazy notes put in them, you're going to always be in tune, but also chords under distortion too. If you want to play a chord more complex than a power chord, a root and a fifth, maybe you want to throw in a third there, maybe add 9. There's going to be a lot less dissonance than if you were playing a guitar without the Evertune, because of course you have to set up your guitars, and setup on these I find is pretty easy. But it also holds your notes in tune, so if you slightly bend the string a little bit, it's going to be okay because it'll hold it in tune. I do keep my guitars within the bend zone, but I do have a little leeway between where you're accidentally bending the string versus where the bend actually kicks in. Of course, the Evertune, it's pretty great, but it's not magic. It is a mechanical system, so it will drift out of tune over time. You do have to tune it at the tuning heads here to keep the tension right if you're staying within the bend zone, because you have to be near that threshold. And as the strings stretch, as the neck shifts, etc., you do need to adjust. You do need to tune it. And you need to actually tune it too, which is done here, because it will drift out of tune over time. I find that all the strings kind of drift together, so they go like slightly flat, maybe slightly sharp. Maybe that's because of the neck, maybe it shifts a bit to swings in the temperature. So it's not magic, but it's a whole lot more stable than if you didn't have an Evertune. So I do check the tuning a few times a day when I'm recording because it needs to be right, but I've had to actually tune it not too often. Versus a different guitar without an Evertune, I will have to tune. And even if that guitar is super robust or something, it's not really the guitar's fault sometimes, because again, I'm living in an apartment. I've got AC that points here and there. It gets hot, it gets cold. Wood will react to temperature no matter what. You still will have to adjust the truss rod and set up the guitar periodically like you would others. So let's talk about overall, the summary, the pros and cons of these, the similarities, the differences, and answer your questions. To review, these are pretty similar guitars, alder body superstrats. Any differences between them are pretty minute, but I've had to really hold the magnifying glass over them for the sake of the discussion to provide enough information to be useful if you're on the fence. So do I recommend these guitars? Well, it's no surprise that I've bought these guitars. I've used these guitars for music, for videos. I do recommend them. I do find them useful. They're solid superstrats that can do a variety of the things I need them to do. They have the specs I want, the stainless steel frets, the maple necks with the ebony fretboards, the 2 humbuckers, etc., the locking tuners. They're pretty good workhorses. I can rely on them to stay in tune. I can play riffs on them and it sounds great. I can shred on them and it sounds great. Of course, shredding on these is pretty good. They're pretty playable. I wouldn't say they're better than Ibanez's when it comes to shredding, but I would say it's more versatile because the neck has a little bit more chunk to it, so my hand won't get as tired. It's more comfortable to riff on these. And these do stay in tune better just automatically because of that Evertune. These are definitely geared towards the metal crowd, which I'm a part of. And at the same time, it is possible to coax other genres out of. So that works perfectly for me because I'm primarily doing metal stuff. Sometimes I do stuff outside of that genre. So this suits what I'm doing. And if you're doing something similar, then I would recommend these to you. What if you're in this demographic, but you're not looking for a guitar like this? What are the alternatives? Like, what if you don't want a Solar, but you want something similar? Well, what first comes to mind is the LTDs, because I mentioned the neck profile is kind of similar to those. There's a lot of LTDs now that do have these features, the ebony board, the stainless steel frets, the Evertune, and they're similarly priced here and there. From there, you can go to different brands depending on your needs. For example, if you want something, I guess, less geared towards riffing and more shredding, maybe an Ibanez would be right up your alley. Since they have thinner necks, wider string spacing, they're definitely built for shred. You could go a different direction with a different brand depending on what they're geared towards too. And now the question you're really looking for the answer for, which one of these do I prefer? Which one is my favorite? I have a lot of good memories with this guitar right here, the A1.6. I've used it in a lot of long recording sessions. I've played some of my favorite songs on it. I've taken it places, to jam practices, to parties sometimes when it was asked for. It's been super useful. It's never let me down. It's stayed in tune. I've actually never broken a string on this one. That's great. And the looks have received compliments too. Even though the flame maple is a veneer, it does get compliments. The neck feels great. It's nice all around. I'd have to say though that ever since I got this S1.6, I've been playing it more. It's a newer edition, and the binding on it, I do have to say the binding isn't quite flush with the body, which is slightly disappointing, but not the end of the world. You can't feel it unless you're actually running your finger along it. Besides that, everything about this guitar has actually been better, surprisingly. It has more sustain to it than the A1.6. And maybe that might be because the neck on this, it feels a little thicker, so maybe it is a little thicker. Maybe that contributes. Fretting the notes does feel more satisfying. They ring out a bit more. Of course, the pickups, I do prefer the sound of a bit more too, but pickups can be changed. So even though the binding is a bit weird and the neck feels a bit thicker, so far it's been, I guess, just a little bit better, so I'm reaching for it more and more. Another bonus is that this white binding over time is going to age, so it'll turn kind of yellow. And then it's the colors of my cat, so black and yellow because her eyes are yellow. Maybe that's just a thing for me. But then going back to the question of which one of these do I recommend, again, I'm picking at super minor differences. I did say this one has more sustain, but that difference is pretty slight. If I needed a guitar that had more sustain than this guitar, I would probably pick a different one. Like my J Custom, for example, that has sustain for days, and I would pick that one. Or maybe the RG550 that I picked up recently. It isn't enough of a difference between these two where one would work and the other wouldn't. They're both super similar. But if I did have to recommend one to you over the other, I guess I'd recommend this one based off of what I just said about it. Although I can't fully guarantee that this S guitar being super good isn't just a product of slight variations from guitar to guitar. For all we know, there's an A series out there that feels just like this. So the honest truth is, if I had to recommend one or the other to you, I would say get the one that you like the look of better, because that's going to inspire you to play it more and you'll get better at playing it. And because the differences between these guitars are so slight, getting better at playing it is going to matter a whole lot more than like a 1% difference between the two. Of course, maybe things like this having the carveaways on top and this not, maybe that matters a super lot to you. And of course, if you dislike the Evertune, obviously I couldn't recommend either of these guitars to you. I'd recommend something without an Evertune. But yeah, those are my thoughts on these guitars. They're both pretty awesome. I've used them both in my projects and will continue to do so. So if you're thinking about these, they're within your budget and they have the specs you like, I say go for it and pick the one you like the look of. So there we have it. Did I answer questions? Do you have any other thoughts or comments? Be sure to let me know down in the comments below. You know, this is YouTube, so I have to say the YouTube things. I just have to. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, share the video, print out every frame and mail it, all that good stuff. And as always, peace.